Hey, welcome to Restoration. My name is Matt. So glad you could join us for this message on Shabbat or whatever day you are watching this message. We are continuing our series, The Good Fight, which is through the New Testament book of 1 Timothy. And today, in part 7 of The Good Fight, we're talking about how to carry the weight of honor. Now, here is how you're supposed to treat people. After all these things that Paul is saying to Timothy of these false teachers in Ephesus, he's keeping in mind that these elders are false teachers and they're older than Timothy, and he has to tread carefully because he's a young man and a young leader. Paul instructs his spiritual son how he's supposed to treat people. He says to him in 1 Timothy 5, verse 1, "Never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him as a father, to younger men as brothers, and older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with complete purity." So we see the word honor is going to come up a lot in this passage, and we're going to talk about how to carry the weight of honor. Now, these verses in chapter 5 are a natural flow from the verses in the end of chapter 4. The content continues to reflect concern over Timothy's relationship to the congregational community, but in a very specific way, also his own youthfulness as a leader and paying attention to himself and to his own teaching is how we ended the sermon last week at the end of chapter 4. And because most of us grew up in unhealthy family systems, even the most healthy family has weeded? No, I don't know. Fed in there. It affects the way we talk to men and to women, and all of our views of relationships end up being skewed through the unhealth of our family system. What if you've never been exhorted, or you've never were able to exhort or correct your father in a healthy way? How would you know how to speak to older men if your relationship with your father is off and there's all kinds of family health issues? You don't know how to deal with relationships with other people because the relationships in your family were and perhaps still are messed up. How do you know how to honor your father and mother? And, well, it's interesting because as we look at the word honor and carrying the weight, we know that in Jewish interpretation, honor your father and mother is a bridge between the two tablets of the 10 Commandments, or in Judaism we call them the 10 words. That the Torah does not say how the 10 words were laid out on the tablets, just that God wrote them with his finger on these 2 stone tablets. You know, he's the first to download from the cloud onto his tablet. So the natural interpretation of how they're laid out is the 5 commandments on one tablet and 5 on the other. And even far before Yeshua, the understanding was that the 5 and 5 break down to 2, which is love God and love people. So the first 5 of the 10 commandments have to do with our relationship with God. The second 5 have to do with our relationship with people. So Yeshua breaks down the commandments to love God and love your neighbor. It's a first century understanding of the tablets of the 10 commandments. And honor your father and mother, the 5th commandment, is really the link between the 2 sets. How you relate to your parents is how you first understand how to relate to God. And how you relate to your parents is how we first understand how to relate to people, because they're the first human relationships in our lives. So in the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20 and verse 12, it says, "Honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you." The word for honor in Hebrew is kavod, and it means heavy or weighty. That honor is something you have to carry because it's heavy. You're carrying something of weight. So to honor your father and mother is to carry the weight of the gift of life that they gave you. That's heavy. I know, I think Back to the Future where Marty says, wow, that's really heavy, Doc. And Doc says, there's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull? No, heavy as in weighty. It's a weight that we're supposed to carry with all the mess of our family systems. That honor is to be grateful for the life that your parents gave you, even if life is the only good thing they gave you. The commandment to honor one's human parents is compared to honoring God. That the Talmud says that since there are three partners in the creation of you, God and your mother and your father, that honor showed to parents is the same honor that we show to God. But what if you didn't learn because your parents weren't good at teaching those things? Or in some cases, the system was so unhealthy that they taught you the opposite of how to honor and be honored. Well, Rabbi Shraga Simon says this in his blog on aish.com. He says, the mitzvah of honoring parents does not depend on what your parents did for you or even whether they were good parents. Rather, we honor parents simply because they gave us the gift of life. If one does not know how to honor their parents for the gift of life, then one will have trouble honoring anyone in their lives. Even trouble honoring yourself. So one passage in the Talmud says this. It says it's not the place that a man occupies that gives him honor, but the man gives honor to the place that he occupies. Or another saying is this, who is honored? Well, he who honors others, that's who's honored. So, thinking along the same lines, in the letter to Ephesians, which is where Timothy is leading in the city of Ephesus, Paul writes this in Ephesians 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, quoting Exodus 20, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. What is the promise that's connected to honoring your father and mother? Well, back to the Exodus 20, Paul points out that honoring your parents equals your days may be long, or long days meaning long life. Successful people have a healthy view of their parents, even if their parents are no good and didn't teach them anything good. They gave us life, and that's enough for honor. So how can you carry the weight of the honor of honoring your parents? How can you carry the weight of honoring your parents? And here's three things. You have to believe that they did the best they could with what they had. You have to be grateful for life that they gave you. And you also have to take the good and leave the bad. My dad's parents were great singers, and my dad is a great singer. In my life, a singer of Hebrew liturgy, and every time I sing, I honor my Rosenberg grandparents and my dad. At the same time, my dad's parents were never around for him. They abandoned my dad, and my dad did the best he could to always be around me. He was often distracted because his parents were workaholics, but he was, and still is, always available to me. My mom's parents were super fun people, especially to share a meal with, as any Italians are. And my mom is fun to share a meal with. We laugh a lot. And every time I have people at a full table and we enjoy a meal together and we laugh a lot, I honor my DeCaro grandparents and my mom. But at the same time, my mom's dad abandoned her. And my mom's mom was abusive in my mom's childhood. And my mom did the best she could to raise me to always feel safe and loved. And she also lived with a lot of fear because she had a lot to be afraid of. And she also made me feel safe and loved. There's good and there's bad. And I am only here because of the people who came before me. And I honor all of them by living my life the best I can. And it will go well with me in my days that I have on this earth. Timothy knows and understands these things from the Torah. So Paul continues more specifics and caring now. He honor men and honor women, and then he talks about honoring widows. He's reminding Timothy how to care for people, not like the false teachers and elders, but instead you have to honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to show devotion to their own home and give back to their parents, for this is pleasing before God. In one of the commentaries, it says children are to put their religion, or we've talked about in this series, godliness, into practice by repaying the earlier care that they themselves have received. This repayment of a parent or grandparent is pleasing to God, and almost certainly is a reflection of the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. But Timothy knows how to honor his parents. How do you carry the weight of the gift of life from your father and the gift of the knowledge of the scriptures from your mother and your grandmother? You know that it's pleasing to God and a part of godliness, as we've talked about throughout the letter of 1 Timothy. And that got me thinking, because I wonder if Timothy's mother and grandmother were widows. You know, Timothy's father is only mentioned as a Greek, and the reason why Timothy was not circumcised in Acts 16. But he either dies or disappears because we don't hear of him again. And Paul becomes Timothy's spiritual father and takes him to be circumcised, which was his physical father neglected. And maybe he died. We don't know. He's not mentioned. But Paul does mention Timothy's mother and grandmother. In another letter he writes Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, he says to Timothy, I recall the genuine faithfulness within you, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure it is within you as well. Later in 2 Timothy chapter 3, he says, you, however, Timothy, continue in what you've learned and what you've become convinced of, for you know from whom you have learned, and from childhood you have known the sacred writings that are able to make you wise, leading to salvation through trusting in Messiah Yeshua. There are these real widows, Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy. There's real widows and not the fake widows. And he says in verse 8, he says, look, one who is really a widow and has been left alone has put her hope in God and continues in petitions and prayers day and night. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Insist on these things so that they might be beyond criticism. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those in his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Look, if you don't understand how to honor your father and mother, you don't understand how to honor God. We must care for those who came before us. Unfortunately, this specific verse, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, is the verse that's used oddly and very out of context as the reason that men are the ones that are supposed to provide for their families financially. But provide is not about money or work. It's all the things that go on in honoring your parents. And scholars like N.T. Wright and Sandra Glanz say that the Greek is actually inclusive, meaning both men and women, people, children, male, female. They should take care of their father and mother and not just leave their care to the community of faith. Look, I'm not, and neither is Paul, talking about the difficulties of what it takes to actually care for elderly parents. He's not talking about having the real hard conversations and you doing the best you can to figure it out. He's talking about false teachers who were themselves or teaching others that they didn't have the responsibility to care for their parents in Ephesus. They were putting it on the community of faith rather than taking their own responsibility seriously. Which is why Paul gives guidelines for what he calls real widows and how to honor them. He says in 1 Timothy 5, verse 9, he says, let a widow be listed only if she's at least 60, was the wife of one husband, well known for good deeds, if she raised children, if she showed hospitality, if she washed the feet of the holy people, and if she helped those in trouble, and if she devoted herself to every good work. I mean, that sounds like the greatest person in the history of the world. In fact, there is a widow named Anna in Luke chapter 2 after the birth of Yeshua who is described this very way. And what Gordon Fee says, the commentator, he says, look, the real widow seems to be set up as an ideal to contrast the young widows in the same way that Timothy is in contrast to the false teachers. They're both models. A good leader is like Timothy. A bad leader is like the false teachers. God's child, in God, one takes care of parents, is a good child. The bad child is one who does not. A good widow is like Anna in Luke chapter 2. A bad widow is one who takes advantage of the community for themselves. These are all models and, in one sense, extremes. They're ideals. They do not take into account real life and real relationships. They don't take into account all the layers of these relationships. They are Paul's reminders to Timothy to do what is right and instruct people in the communities in Ephesus to do what is right when it comes to widows. So, even for us today, not just with widows, but with all people. How can you carry the weight of honoring people? If we honor our father and mother, we have to honor other people. So how can you carry the weight of honoring people? Well, you've got to believe that people are doing the best they can with what they have. You have to be grateful for the lives of other people. And you have to, in relationships, take the good and leave the bad. Sounds very similar to how we honor our parents. Because it is. Timothy's issue is that these false teachers are teaching and are now influencing people to not do what the scriptures tell us to do. To use the scriptures to twist them with these godless myths and genealogies and mess people up, leading people away from God while claiming to lead people to God. I mean, we have to ask the question, why are there so many widows in Ephesus? Old widows and young widows. And it seems to me and to others, to some scholars, that it may be that some of these widows were some of the false teachers who were from the cult of Artemis, continuing to believe and teach what the cult of Artemis would do here. Artemis was a virgin, and many of the women who followed Artemis were virgins. And a widow could also be a reference to someone who never married or had children, with no husband or children to take care of them in their old age. These women were left with nothing in the first century in the Roman Empire, especially if they became followers of Yeshua. Because to deny Artemis in Ephesus was a death sentence. Not literally put to death, but you might as well be. Because if you have no family of your own, now you turn to this community of outcasts and followers of Yeshua instead of Artemis. And what are you supposed to do now? There seems to be all of these widows who are turning to Yeshua and are needing to be cared for by their new family, the family of God. And the widows who really had no one and needed help in the culture and are disregarded by the culture are now not being helped by the community of faith because it's all being used on people that don't actually need the help. So it seems like there's a list for the real widows, and like any system, there are seemingly people who are looking to take advantage of the community of faith in Ephesus and their help, which is why Paul says, refuse younger widows. For when their sensual desires draw them away from Messiah, they want to get married and facing judgment because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle, going around from house to house, and not just idle, but also gossipers and busybodies, saying things they should not. This verse sounds a whole lot like Paul is calling women gossips and busybodies. Like, the gossip's just girl talk. You know, this is what women do. This is what the ladies do. But actually, I think what's happening is some of these false widows were false teachers. and they're sharing their false teachings from house to house. It's the same phrase that Luke uses in Acts when he talks about communities being in people's homes, that congregational meetings were happening in homes, and that some of these women that were some kind of widows were false teachers who were teaching people not to marry in chapter 4, and these teachings were spreading to all of these house fellowships. The word for gossip means to talk nonsense or foolishness. And it's used most often in the context of speaking something foolish or absurd in comparison to the truth. It's like Paul saying, instead of just gossipers, they're purveyors of false teaching. The false teachings that Paul's concerned with in chapter 1, and some we're going to read in chapter 6 next week. And as for the word busybody, well, Sandra Gland says in her book, Nobody's Mother, she says that there's a form of the same word that's used in Acts 19, which is this situation in Ephesus when Paul is there and he heals a girl who can tell the future, and she can't tell the future anymore because now the demons are gone, and it's affecting all the business of all the people who make statues of Artemis. And we know from Acts 19 that this word here that's translated as busybodies also has something to do with the magic arts. We know from Acts 19 and from other first century Greek writings that magic was a big part of the problem in Ephesus, and that magic arts were connected to the worship of Artemis. Perhaps these are some of the teachings of demons that Paul mentions in chapter 4 we talked about last week. What if instead of just gossips and busybodies, because you know that's what women do, it was actually some of the false teachers that Paul and Timothy are concerned with, and that their false teachings had to do with the cult of Artemis and the role of women in leadership and the use of magic in connection to the occult. To Timothy, in a place that loves the occult, Paul speaks of the devil's trap in chapter 3 and verse 7. He describes the one who is manifest as seen by angels in chapter 3 and verse 16. He warns of deceiving spirits and demonic teaching and elect angels. It's all the language in Greek of the city of Ephesus. And we've already talked about in this series about all the titles that Paul gives to Yeshua that in Ephesus belong to Artemis. And he continues, it seems, to talk about Artemis and the people who have come from the worship of Artemis as false teachers, both men and women, and some of these widows without men in their lives who are spreading their false teachings through house communities all through Ephesus. So Paul gives Timothy the advice, which is the opposite of the advice that he gives to young widows in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in the city of Corinth, where he says, I wish they would get married. If they can't control themselves, they should get married. But in Ephesus, where the widow problem is different because of the cult of Artemis, Paul says, therefore, I want younger widows to get married, have children, manage a household, and give no opportunity to the enemy for slander. For some have already gone astray after Satan. And if any woman of faith has widows in need, let her help them, and not let the community be burdened, so it may help the real widows, to help people who are actually need help. Well, some of the widows were not really widows. They were taking advantage of the generosity of the congregations and communities in Ephesus. And the problem is, it takes away from the real widows who need help. Now, some people don't ask for help when they need it because they don't want to be a burden to other people, but they actually need the help and they should ask. And that can be both good and bad, depending on the heart and understanding of yourself. If you need help, you should ask. And it will affect how you trust God or not in community. Some people really need the help, and we can't even keep our mouths straight. That some of these fake widows were some of the false teachers, and they were stirring people through gossip and mixing faith with the magic arts of Ephesus and the cult of Artemis. And we, followers of Yeshua, often use our prayers like incantations. At the same time, followers of Yeshua will rail against Harry Potter and Halloween and wizards. Don't get stuck there, because it's not the thing that matters. It's because everybody uses different things. But then at the same time, we pray like we believe in magic. My friend Tim Ross said in his podcast recently, there are too many believers unknowingly practicing witchcraft and calling it prayer. Look, that was the issue with some of these false widows and false teachers. And that is the issue with so many of us. You don't have to stay there. You can right yourself through your relationship with God and with other people. We often push God to give us what we want and what we think we need. And I'm guilty of this in my life, as everyone else is. I've spent much of time in the last few years in counseling, understanding myself and repenting for what I did not see in myself before. And it's so painful. And it's the right kind of pain. It's how we carry the weight of honor. Look, in almost 20 years of ministry, I've said things to older men that I wish I could take back. I've tried to correct people in my youth, but my correction was full of my own ego and trying to prove that I had wisdom as a young leader. I've not always treated older women like mothers, and younger women like sisters, and younger brothers like, younger men like younger brothers. I can own that, and I can face that now. I was so unaware of myself that I hurt people I loved with the things I said and I did. And the Lord has opened so much of that to me, and I've repented, and I've sought forgiveness. And what we need is to do what God has already told us to do. We need to stop adding to what God says with what we wish God would say. If you can't hear God, that's okay. You can learn how to hear God in community. But we need to stop waiting for God to do something while ignoring what God has told us to do. We have to learn to carry the weight of honor. You have to learn how to carry the weight of honor for your parents. You have to learn to carry the weight of honor for other people. And you have to learn to carry the weight of honor for yourself. But how can you carry the weight of honoring yourself? Well, you have to believe that you are doing the best you can with what you have. You have to be grateful for the life you've been given. And all through your life, you have to take the good and leave the bad. You have to give attention to yourself and what you teach. And do what God wants you to do. To care for your family. If you don't have physical family, then care for your spiritual family. If you don't have spiritual family, then get into community that's trying to live what they teach. We try and we fail often, and we're hopefully listening for God's voice for this time and this place and this city and this people. We're supposed to care for one another and carry the weight of honor for one another, for your parents, for others, and for yourself. Now, next week, we're going to wrap up 1 Timothy and Paul's encouragement to his spiritual son to be different than these false teachers, so that we can all keep fighting the good fight and not lose focus when we fight all of the wrong fights. I love you guys. I'll see you next week.